We're just going to let a few more people come in and then we'll get going. In the meantime, feel free to obviously type your questions into the Q&A and we'll obviously answer these as we get through to the session. I can see Camille's just joined as well.
Hello.
Hi, Camille.
Is the video? Hi guys, thanks so much to everyone joining. We're just waiting for everyone to get logged on and then we'll get going. In the meantime, as I say, pop your questions in the Q&A and we will answer them as we go along. All right, we'll just wait on Emily to come back. She's just gone to grab a drink. As I say, in the meantime, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A and then we'll get going. Okay, lovely. So let's make a start. Thank you so much everyone that's joined tonight. As you can see, I've got 3 lovely new faces joining me today and it's wonderful to see everyone joining as well. So let's get going. First of all, as usual, I always just like to start by giving a little plug to Bite Medicine. So for those of you who are new to this webinar series and are new to Bite Medicine, they're a really fantastic education company and they have a question bank and online textbook for you to use. I used their resources myself during medical school and I honestly found them so helpful, and they do provide a lot of free resources as well. So make sure to check them out in the link in the top right-hand corner that you can see there. So we can obviously see that we've got a little panel together today for our Q&A session. So what we were going to do now is just introduce all of ourselves. So I'll start with myself. Hi, I'm Shivani. Hopefully you guys will be familiar with me by now. I've been doing the lecture series for the past few months. I am a graduate of the University of Birmingham Med School, and when I applied to the SFP last year, I applied in West Midlands and London, and I'm a current SFP doctor in the West Midlands. And I'm looking towards a medical career with a mixture of research and teaching. So now to hand over to our lovely panel. First of all, I'll hand over to Camille to introduce himself.
So thank you, Shivani, and hello everyone. My name is Camille. I have also graduated from the University of Birmingham this year. I've applied both in the East and the West Midlands, and I'm currently an SFP doctor in the East Midlands, currently in my gastroenterology rotation. My clinical interests are primarily surgery related, particularly hepatobiliary, and my main interest is in robotic surgery.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Camille. Emily, if I hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name's Emily. I'm also a graduate from the University of Birmingham. I applied to the Northwest in London, and I'm currently an SFP doctor in Salford in Northwest. I'm on gastro at the moment, but main interests are within acute medicine.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Emily. And last but not least, Rich, do you want to introduce yourself?
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name's Rich. I finished the SFP August just gone. I did it in the West Midlands in a medical education SFP. I applied to West Midlands and also Severn. Yeah, looking to the future, I'm hoping to apply for IMT and medical oncology this year. So looking forward to our session this evening.
Lovely. Thanks so much, guys, for joining. It's really lovely to have you all here to answer lots of questions. So this is our very last session in the SFP series, which I'm really sad about. I've really enjoyed delivering the session, but don't worry if you haven't been able to catch on all of the sessions. They're all available on YouTube for you to watch. So if you want to watch them in the run-up to your interview, you can find them on the Bite Medicine YouTube channel. Essentially today, we're also going to go through a little bit of a recap of all of the interview advice that I've given over the past few sessions. And then the majority of the session will be a Q&A with our lovely panelists. And we'll talk through some of the questions that were submitted to us in advance and also your questions that you have today as well. So please pop them in the Q&A as I'm talking and we will answer them over the course of the session. Hopefully we'll cap this session about 7:30 for you all so you can get away to have some dinner and things. So let's start with a bit of a recap of SFP interviews. So hopefully you guys will know that SFP interviews is something that's very common in the application process and pretty much all the deaneries have them. But the structure of the interview very much depends on the deanery that you're applying for. So one of the key tips is to always check with your deanery and always read the guidance that they give you in advance. In the course of the interview, they will commonly test three main sort of areas. So the first will be your kind of clinical acumen in some form of clinical station. The second will be some form of academic aspects, because obviously you're applying for an SFP post. And the final bit will be about your motivation for the program. And a lot of people find the interview quite an intimidating prospect, but actually it's a real opportunity for you to sell yourself to your prospective deanery. So you should try and view it as an opportunity. So there are two main types of clinical station, first of all. The first is an A to E type station, which is essentially all about your ability to manage and assess an acutely unwell patient, which is something that you'll have to do a lot as an F1. However, there's also a different type of clinical station, which is more about how you work through real place dilemmas that you'd come across commonly in the hospital setting. So in terms of kind of top tips for this sort of station, the key with this sort of station is to kind of fall back on some of the structures we talked about. So your A to E, the 5 S's and SPIs. Make sure that you're thinking about both the patients if it's a kind of A to E sort of station, and making sure your practice is safe, and also kind of making use of your MDT as you would in real life as well. And you are often rewarded for kind of leaning on the support of the MDT. Particularly for deaneries that rely heavily on the A to E station, it's really important to be familiar with key NICE guidelines, common drug doses, and normal reference ranges, as they're not often given to you in the interview as well. In terms of things to avoid, make sure that you're always acting kind of within your competence and avoiding things that would potentially compromise the patient's safety. And as we highlighted, particularly for the situation discussions type stations, remember that you are an F1. And so try to avoid being unrealistic about the course of action you would take in these scenarios as well, because they want to see how you would genuinely respond in that sort of situation. So now to quickly recap the academic station, again, like with the clinical station, there's two main sorts of types. So the common types are the critical appraisal station, which is essentially where you'd be asked to kind of appraise an abstract on the day or a paper in advance. And essentially the idea of the station is to test what you understand of research methodology and check that you're able to process and appraise literature. And like with the clinical station, you can also have sort of situation discussions around academic medicine and common dilemmas that you would encounter in the academic workplace. So in terms of kind of tips for this particular type of station, a really good thing to start off with is making sure that you're confident in critical appraisal. So make sure that you understand all of the key terminology, which we went through in the academic lecture. And like with the clinical station, have a structure in mind for your appraisal process, so that regardless of what you're faced with, you have a systematic way of combating those stations. Make sure that you are aware of kind of research in your field of interest as well, because ultimately you're trying to demonstrate your interest in the program and for the strand that you're applying for. And it would look really impressive for you to be able to be aware of the research that's relevant to your field and comment on this in your interview as a way of showing interest. In terms of kind of things to avoid, make sure that you always focus on the fact that being a doctor is your ultimate priority. So in terms of your academic roles, obviously they are important, but if there's ever a situation where you have to choose, you should always remember that being a doctor comes first. And in terms of kind of working through your answers, particularly for the critical appraisal, try to focus on the bits that you think are relevant, because ultimately you will only have about a minute and a half for every answer or so, and you need to make sure that you're highlighting the key points rather than just listing. And finally, to just kind of recap the motivation station, you'll remember if you attended this session that we talked about two main types of questions. So one sort of theme is talking about your motivation for the SFP and kind of pursuing academic training long term. And the second is all about what you can bring to the program, so skills-based questions. So in terms of kind of succeeding in this sort of question line, it's important that you understand your research theme or the strand of SFP that you're applying for. You understand the deanery that you're applying for and what they could potentially offer you. And you also understand how the academic training pathway works. And I talked about this in some of the previous lectures, so go and watch those back if you're not quite sure and want a bit more explanation. Particularly for the skills-based question, it's worth remembering that all-important person specification that we talked about in the white space questions lecture as well. So make sure that you can think of and have examples for each of the skills that are mentioned on those person specification points. And finally, this is really important in all the interviews, but always make sure that you're linking back to why you want to do the SFP and how you're a suitable candidate for the SFP in all of your answers. Because remember, whatever the line of questioning, they're ultimately testing to see whether you are a suitable candidate for their deanery. So you need to make sure all of your answers reflect that. In terms of kind of things to avoid, make sure that you try to have firm structures and avoid being wishy-washy, because if you try and start listing and not having clear reasoning, it makes your answer quite difficult to follow. In the sort of same kind of vein, it's important to try and avoid rote learning your answers as well, because interviewers can tell if you've over-rehearsed an answer. So the way to kind of avoid that sort of unnatural tone when you're giving sort of motivational answers is to learn about bullet points and think of examples rather than rote learning a specific answer. So in the kind of last lecture we did, I talked about ethics law and key medical guidance. And this is something that's really important to all SFP interviews. And I'm sure my colleagues will agree, but even though if it's not necessarily asked for in the interview, it's something that is still often rewarded on mark schemes. So try and always think about any ethical and legal considerations there are in the kind of questioning they're asking you. So we talked about things like the 4 pillars of medical ethics, the kind of definitions of consent and capacity and the criteria for those. We talked about detention of patients, and importantly, we talked about good medical practice. And these 4 areas are all kind of key aspects that I would expect an SFP candidate to know about in preparation for their interview. So make sure you have a look through that lecture and read some of the guidelines surrounding that. So just to kind of give some final interview tips, summarizing all of that. In terms of kind of general interview good practice, always try to pause before you give an answer and fall back on structures to make sure you sound like you've given a considered answer in a well-structured way that's easy to follow. It's very easy to be really nervous and for that to show on your face, but remember to try and use open body language and smile as much as possible in the interview to kind of engage with the interviewers a bit. In terms of kind of preparation, I would recommend starting a few weeks before your interview, because there's a lot of learning, particularly for the academic stations, to do, and make use of colleagues that are applying to your deanery as well so that you can practice together. In terms of things to avoid, make sure that you are avoiding not being informed about your deanery in the post you're applying for, and avoid giving incomplete answers, because ultimately this is your one opportunity to sell yourself to your deanery. So you want to make sure that you've mentioned all the key points that you want to mention. So in terms of kind of resources for preparation, I've talked about quite a few over the series, and I've just kind of summarized them here. In terms of kind of books and things, for your clinical emergencies, the back of the Oxford Handbook is really helpful and has all of the emergencies that you need to go through. And this particular book by Olivier Picard is really good for kind of the motivational questions. As we've talked about, make use of us as SFP doctors and other applicants. And there are loads of kind of free online mock interviews that will be happening around now. So watch out for those. And you can also obviously watch loads of videos on YouTube. I think somebody made a really useful playlist of all of the kind of YouTube videos that people had made over the years of SFP advice. So definitely try and watch some of those as well. So that's kind of a little whistle-stop tour of interviews. Hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a base to go away and either watch the other lectures back, or maybe it's inspired a few questions. So without further ado, let's move on to the question portion of the evening. And I'm going to start with some of the questions that we received in advance, and I'll throw these out to our panel. So I've just got the questions in front of me here. The first set of questions that we'd received in advance was about kind of in preparation for the interview. So the first question is, how many publications should we be first author for? So guys, who would like to take on that question?
I don't mind starting with that, because I had no first author publications when I applied. I think if that's amazing if you do have one or more than one, or whatever, but I think in my experience of writing white space questions and going through the interview process, it's more about the things you have done and what you've learned from them. So I've been involved in kind of research and other bits, and not been first author, but I still learned a lot about data collection, analysis, writing for publication, submitting for publication, and could draw on kind of the experiences that I did have. But in terms of points and things, there are ways to get points without having a first author publication, because it is quite challenging. Med school's difficult as it is, without the pressure of trying to get loads of first author publications. So if you've got one, great, but I wouldn't stress if you don't, because it didn't affect my application or job.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Emily said there. And I think what Emily really highlighted was the idea of what you learned from the project. And I think at this sort of level, which is essentially an entry position into academic medicine, they care far more about what you learned than whether or not you're first author. So that's really important. Thank you. So Camille, if I can bring you into this as well, is there anything you'd wish you'd known before you'd apply to the SFP?
I think my main piece of advice would be, I was really stressed before the interview, and I came into it thinking, oh, they're going to ask me all those difficult questions that I'm not going to know the answers to. And that was definitely not the case. And I hope you're going to have a similar opinion. That, in my opinion, it was quite actually standard. It was almost expected questions a lot of the time. But it was just about making sure you answer them in a concise manner and don't go off the tangent too much, because you just remember that there is a time limit on it, and you can't just spend the whole time of the interview answering one question on it. So I thought that would be the main point that I would have wished to have learned.
Yeah, thank you. And Emily, you mentioned something really interesting about programs and choosing programs as well before you applied, before we started recording. I don't know if you wanted to share that with the group as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I applied, I'm currently in the Northwest. When I applied, it was kind of with a view to doing medical education, and that was kind of what I spoke about in my interview. But I found that the hospital that I'm in have been quite flexible in terms of the actual track that we're doing. So it's not kind of set in stone. I don't know if this is the case in other deaneries or other hospitals in the West Midlands, but I found that I still haven't really had to make a decision about leadership, research, education. It's been quite open, which has been really great for me, because it's allowed me to kind of use the experience I've had so far in F1 to kind of decide what I want to do with it, and I'm not sort of stuck on a path. So that's been kind of a good thing for me, and something I didn't realize coming into the interview that was an option. But yeah, I can't speak for everywhere, but the Northwest and Salford, that's how it's been.
Yes, that's really interesting to know, because I think a lot of people have the perception that if you apply for a program, you have to stick to that program. So it's well worth researching into what your deanery offers, because there may be little perks like that you don't know about. So Rich, I'm going to ask you the next set of questions. So people have asked what you should be doing in the week before your interview and the night or day before your interview. Do you have any advice for this at all?
Yeah, I'll start with the night before, which is very much try and keep calm, find something to do to distract yourself, phone call with a friend, make a nice meal, that sort of thing. If you're having to travel, and I don't know if that is the case this year, but if you were having to travel to an interview, making sure that, you put that travel plans in place with plenty of time. And also, if it's a case of you're doing it virtually, make sure your devices are working, make sure you've downloaded Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever you're using, make sure your charger is working, prepare for all those eventualities, because it would be, such a crying shame to miss out on the fantastic opportunity because of some hardware problem. I think in the week running up to it, little and often is definitely going to be useful. So putting, half an hour to an hour aside each day to say, right, today I'm going to, practice in front of the mirror or with a dictaphone or even, with a video camera to answer some questions. You can have kind of sent questions to your friends that are also applying to kind of test each other, or you can, find some example questions online to practice. But I think, looking back through Shivani's video set at the general themes that have been covered, if you came up with some questions around those themes, you would be very well prepared for the interviews in general. So, coming up with some practice questions on motivation, thinking about how you would appraise a paper and having a go with some practice papers, in the week running up, that would definitely be good use of your time.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much. That's really, really good advice. And I definitely agree with kind of having goals for each day as a way of staying motivated, because it's very hard to keep on top of the workload when you're trying to study for med school alongside it. So having that sort of goal and working on areas that you have identified as things that you need to improve on is really important. So just to kind of mention the few of the specific interview questions that have come up in the chat tonight as well. So some people have mentioned that they have to do some presentations for their interviews this year. I don't believe this is something that I have heard about in interviews before, but I thought it might be worth throwing it out to the group if they have any advice for doing short presentations and any kind of sort of presentation tips that they can offer. Perhaps Emily, if we start with you, because I know you're also a med ed at SFP as well.
In terms of presentation, it's not something I had to do for either of my interviews. I don't know if that's kind of presenting on a topic or something that you've done before. I guess you would have to look at the kind of specific deanery guidance as to kind of what they're expecting from any sort of presentation. But in terms of tips, it would be mostly things that we've spoken about with regards to other aspects of the interview. I think just to be prepared, speak clearly, don't kind of try and throw too much in. I think with a presentation, they'll be mostly looking at your communication skills and how well you can convey information and possibly answer questions and things afterwards. So I think be prepared. And what I would say is I probably over prepared for some of my interviews, so just be careful about doing that. I know we were all quite nervous before our interview, but I think I definitely perhaps did too much and was pleasantly surprised that things were quite standard and friendly. So just as a general tip, as we were talking about preparation and things, yeah, you can definitely do too much. So the best way to do it is be prepared, but be relaxed about things and don't overdo it.
And Rich is obviously a current clinical teaching fellow, so this is very much his wheelhouse. Rich, do you have any other tips to add for this particular question?
Yeah, obviously 5 minutes is not a long time, and depending on what you've been asked to present on, whether it's something you get to choose or you've been given the topic, that that does change things. But I would say there are some general med ed principles that you could actually show off during this. So for example, the idea of learning objectives. So perhaps once you've introduced the title, say, by the end of this presentation, I would hope that the listener will be able to achieve X, Y, Z. And you want them to be able to demonstrate or apply understanding or anything like that. Those are the kind of key terms you want to be including within your learning objectives. You can go away and read up about things like Bloom's taxonomy to get those key words. And then at the end of your presentation, if you can put aside 30 to 45 seconds to ensure that you're summarizing what you've said that proves you've met those learning objectives. Now that can be as simple as, today we've spoken about X topic, and I hope you'll realize that now that I've spoken for 5 minutes, I've proved that we've hit the learning objectives. Or you can be more original, and you could potentially even have a little sort of, Q&A at the end of your presentation. And, it would be bold, but you could even, point to the screen and say, after what I've said, would anyone like to answer the question on, confirming that what I've said has gone in? Because that's, realistically, that's when you're giving a lecture, that's what you do, isn't it? You say what you're going to talk about, you talk about it, and then you assess that knowledge in, a fun little way at the end. So that might be a nice thing to introduce. I recognize that some people have their interview tomorrow. That might be a bit stressful to add it in, but it could be something that could be quite a powerful inclusion.
Thanks so much, Rich. That's really, really interesting advice, and obviously top advice from a clinical teaching fellow as well. I think if you were able to demonstrate even just some of the concepts that Rich talked about there, it would be very impressive and already show an advanced understanding of core principles of medical education. So next question is probably for Emily and me. It relates more to the London interview. So it's about the kind of clinical scenario in the London interview. So if I kick off with this one, so London a lot of kind of all the deaneries is probably one of the most transparent deaneries there are. And so in their deanery guidance, they give very clear instructions of what the station is like. And it tends to be an A to E type station, as they say in their deanery instructions. So you'll typically be given a patient to discuss, and they'll kind of ask you questions about the kind of management of that patient to assess whether you're able to assess and manage an acutely unwell patient. Emily, I don't suppose you have any tips for this based on your experience as well?
I think for the London clinical station, it was very much what I had expected it to be based on the guidance that was available. Quite a standard presentation. I was just allowed to talk through my A to E just as I'd practiced. I think I had kind of been prepared for London to possibly interrupt and ask questions or pick up on things. So I think be prepared for that, but also be prepared to just talk for 5 minutes or however long with your A to E. Yeah, it was. I think I was pleasantly surprised at kind of how standard it was, and I think just having practiced my A to E and got very familiar with kind of key emergency stations is what helped with that one, really.
Yeah, and if I can add on to that, one thing I think that's really important is to remember to act within your competency in the scenario as well, because in the scenario you will always be kind of an F1 or someone at your level of training. So be aware of people you can ask for help, and be aware of when you would want to ask for help in a realistic setting, and don't feel like you'd have to work through the entire scenario without ever once asking for help. So showing awareness of that is really important and shows that you're a safe clinician as well. So I briefly saw quite an interesting question come up about kind of papers to read in advance of the interview and kind of practicing with that. So Camille, I know as part of your interview, you also had to do a lot of preparing of papers and appraising papers. Do you have any advice on kind of papers to prepare in advance of your interview?
Yeah, so I can see from the question as well that there's some disconnect. So during my interview, I did not have to do a presentation. I had to be prepared to answer questions about my paper. But I believe for some parts of the program, for example, medical education, that's a bit different. So that's when you have to do the presentation. I can't advise a bit too much on that. But in terms of the appraisal itself of the paper, I must admit, I went a bit guns blazing into this. So I had it prepared from top to bottom. I knew everything about the paper, everything about the journal, impact factor, etc. That was a bit too much. Just to make sure, right? It is a brief interview, 5-10 minutes to answer questions. So keep it concise, keep it simple, and go back to the basic. Make sure you understand everything that's written in the paper. Make sure you understand the type of graphs that are present in the paper. Know the main limitations. Know your PICO inside and out. And don't expect them to handpick almost every single detail from the paper, because that simply is not going to happen. But as long as you've got a good foundation, you should be able, and you should be prepared to answer most of their questions.
Definitely. I think that's really good advice about filtering there. And I think the same thing applies with abstracts if you're asked to appraise one of those. So although it's good to kind of have a structure when you're working through the abstract, the way of systematically identifying all the potential issues, when you're giving your answer back, remember you only have a limited amount of time to give that answer. So highlight the key issues or the things that would kind of cause problems for you interpreting the data, or things that are important for you to interpret that data, because that's the stuff that they would want you to pick up on. If they want more explanation as well, once you've kind of given your overview, they can ask as well. But yeah, make sure that you're filtering answers according to what's relevant, so that you're giving a kind of clear and comprehensive answer. So is critical appraisal more of a discussion with open-ended questions, or more quick-fire and assessing knowledge? So I think this is something that all of us will have experienced to an extent. So Rich, I don't know if you want to start off here.
Yeah. So I've done 2 SFP interviews, one where I was given something to critically appraise, and one where the expectation was that I had come with something in my head to discuss and critically appraise. In both cases, it was very much a back and forth. Both cases, it got quite intense. I think that's, they always say if an interview feels uncomfortable, it's probably going well. But I think if you're trying to push yourself, then the things you need to be thinking about are, if push came to shove, could you give 3 strengths of any study that you've been, asked to talk about? Is that one you brought, or one they've given you? 3 strengths. Can you also talk about 3 limitations? And also, can you talk about any improvements? And that last one is a really, really challenging thing to do, but it does demonstrate higher kind of order thinking, because it's basically saying, not only can I see the flaws in a study, but I can actually think about methodological approaches to improve the study. So for example, if it was a randomized control trial, but they didn't use blinding, you could say, well, if they'd used blinding, that would have made, this bias be more controlled, blah, blah, blah. Likewise, if it was a certain type of study, be it a cohort or a case control, you could say, ideally, this would have been a study higher on the hierarchy of evidence, such as a randomized control trial or something. So if you can have that ready to discuss, that will come across, really, really favorable for you.
Just had a bit of PowerPoint there. Thank you so much, Rich. That was really a helpful insight. And I think definitely in my experience as well, in terms of kind of the critical appraisal, something that I found as well is it's something that very much varies according to both your deanery and whoever's interviewing as well. So say, for example, in my instance, I think I've had experiences where I was both just allowed to talk through my answer with kind of questions at the end, but also an experience where I was kind of interrupted and kind of asked more specific questions in quick succession as well. So I think my main advice on that point would just be to kind of be prepared for both instances and both extremes. And maybe even when you're practice kind of giving yourself different interview experiences with your friends, so that you can get used to both sorts of concepts as well. So in terms of kind of telling people about a study that they've recently read, if I maybe start with Emily, what would you kind of advise for interview stations where you've been asked to kind of read a study that you've recently read, in terms of kind of picking and also working through that in advance of an interview? What would you advise be there?
So that was something that I had kind of prepared for both my interviews. I was aware that it would be possible for them to say, tell us about something interesting you've read, or whatever. I was never actually got to kind of use that kind of preparation, but I picked 2 papers, one that was kind of surrounding my interest in neurology that I could speak about if that came up, and I also picked one that was to do with medical education. So I had kind of 2 papers in the back of my mind that I'd read and critiqued and kind of had some main points that I wanted to talk about just in case it came up. So I think my advice would be to have at least one paper that you've read recently, because there's nothing more awkward than them asking you what you've read and you not being able to say anything. So have at least one. If you can have 2 that kind of you could fit into different types of answers. So if you're applying for research, something kind of research related, but if you've got other interests in leadership and education, having one that, or even one study that would fit into both that you could know really well, I think would be useful. But definitely have at least something that you could talk about if that were to come up.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that, because ultimately a lot of interviewers or a lot of deaneries don't give that much information in advance. So having that ace up your sleeve in case is really important. And I definitely agree with Emily in that having something you're interested in that reflects your interest is really important. I think my advice on having prepared for that sort of eventuality as well is try and choose information, or try and choose a paper that kind of has stuff that you can talk about. So typically large trials, which are quite easy to appraise compared to some sort of other studies, are really good kind of fodder for you to talk about the appraisal in more detail, and you can kind of talk about all your terminology there, and try and link it back to other bits of research as well that are kind of ongoing at the moment, to show that you're someone that not only has read just the one paper, but has also kind of linked it back and showed how it's kind of fit into the sphere as well. So in terms of kind of other questions as well, let's just have a quick look to see what's come through. So somebody's put in the chat something that I think is a common issue for all of us when we start off with critical appraisal, which is that they find it takes quite a long time for them to read through and interpret the results. So perhaps, Camille, if I come to you, do you have any tips for kind of interpreting results quickly in sort of interview setting?
Right. So you know, I don't have a specific tip, but I just say how I would approach a paper, and I think it's been working pretty well for me so far. So, you know, the first thing I do when I get a paper, I don't read it from top to bottom. The first thing your eyes should be focusing on is the abstract. Read the background, read the methods, read the results and the conclusions, and make sure you understand that bit first. And then once you're happy with that, take each section one at a time and just kind of make sure you know what those sections are for, right? So the introduction is just providing a wider context to it. Methods are explaining how they did the study. Results is the key part. Don't focus too much about the statistics. You know, you don't have to know every single statistical subtest they've done or subcategory they've analyzed, but make sure you know what those results mean in terms of actual practice. And that's where you can find in the discussion section. So both understanding the key parts of the results as well as what they actually mean in real life. That would be my kind of approach to this. I don't know if anyone else has a different.
Yeah, Emily, I'd also be interested to hear your view on this, because obviously for the London interview, we had to appraise literature quite quickly. And so obviously kind of interpreting results quickly was something that was a part of that. Do you have any advice based on your experience of that?
I would echo a lot of what Camille said. I think it's perfectly fine. I would encourage you to just take a deep breath and just read the study and take that time instead of kind of skimming over. I know it can look kind of overwhelming sometimes when there's lots of results, but I found it quite useful just to take that step back, make sure I knew broadly what the paper was talking about and broadly what the results were showing. And then I could spend the rest of the kind of preparation time I had on kind of making sense of the hazard ratios and all of the other kind of stats that were in there. We were allowed to have a pen and paper. So I would, as I was reading it, I would just go through and just write the main points and kind of make sense of it in my head. And then kind of fill in the bits with the results once I'd had time to kind of properly look at it and make sense of everything. So I think take your time and make sure you know what the paper's talking about, because otherwise it will be really difficult to answer the other questions that they ask you afterwards.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that in terms of making a note of things, because obviously in the stress of the interview, it's very easy to forget statistics and things. So if you have a copy of those written down, then that obviously saves you some brain space. I think something that worked for me in that particular instance as well is I quite like looking at statistics first before reading the text around it. And that's because numbers in the abstract just stand out for me or more on the page amongst all of the blur of words. So perhaps if you sit and look at the statistics first and kind of interpret those in isolation, then put it together with the kind of rest of the abstract, that could be a quick way as well for you to kind of look through the results as well. So we had quite an interesting question as well from somebody. Rich, if I can perhaps ask you this. So where can we find examples of clinical scenarios and answers to practice with and critical appraisals and things? How would you go about kind of finding those sorts of things to practice with?
Right. So for clinical scenarios, I think this is a divide and conquer approach. So anyone you know who's currently applying to the SFP, put your heads together, make a little, spreadsheet that you can all edit, and just spend, 10 minutes doing a complete, knowledge dump of anything you think feasibly could be an emergency that comes up. Be structural about it, organize it based on system or specialty. On top of that, then, what you can do is you can get something like the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine. There's a lovely emergency section in there. You could then just mop up any missing topics that you thought, oh, I've never really thought about, Andersonian crisis, but let's add that in just in case. And then it's, a case of going through and saying, am I aware of the mainstay of treatment for each of these emergencies? You'll actually find that as long as you can talk very confidently through an A to E, which is the mainstay of most F1 doctors' work when they're on call, you'll be able to apply any medical emergency to that. However, there are a few exceptions where if you can have had some thought about the clinical emergencies beforehand, such as say seizure, then rather than methodically working through A to E, you can quickly say things like, I'd start a timer, I'd throw on oxygen, I'd pull the buzzer, and you can almost tick the boxes before getting into the nitty-gritty of the A to E. For the academic, I would recommend using the major journals, so New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, BMJ, to essentially just hunt out up-to-date abstracts and share them with your friends, share them with other peers that are applying, and do some practice of unseen critical appraisal. You can do it yourself, find a quick abstract, don't look at it, and then start a timer and practice it. I'd love to hear what the others think about this, because that's how I approached it, but maybe they have a different thought.
Yeah, definitely. I think for the kind of critical appraisal in particular, something that I used to do every night was I'd pull up an abstract through PubMed, and I'd just set a timer for, I think it was like 10-15 minutes, and I'd just practice working through appraising it and then talking it out loud to myself. And something as well that I found to be quite a useful resource in the run up to my interview was that there were loads of free online mock interviews as well that were very kindly put on by SFPs at the time. And it's something that's done this time of year every year pretty much. So definitely go trawling through the Academic Medicine Society's Facebook pages, because more often than not, they will be putting on some sort of event as a kind of free support. So I found that really helpful as well. Emily and Camille, I don't suppose if you have any suggestions for kind of resources and places to get practice material as well.
So I must admit, I've not done much appraisal practice before my actual appraisal of the paper, only because I've done quite a few of it during my university career, during my intercalation. So I think Emily might be a bit better suited to answer this.
I pretty much did exactly the same thing, in that every day for a few days before the interview, I would kind of spend an hour or so just picking random abstracts from kind of top journals and PubMed, and I would again set a timer. I'd set a timer for like 5 minutes to read and make some notes, and then I'd allow myself an extra 5 minutes just because I was practicing to go through and think, right, what have I missed? What are the kind of ethical issues, etc. And then I would just practice presenting that out loud or to housemates and people, and getting kind of that feedback. So I found that the best way to practice, and again attending talks on kind of how to critically appraise, and reading lots of different types of studies. I would be familiar with RCTs, but be familiar with the other types of studies because they can come up.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really good advice. I think we all pretty much agree on that, which is nice as well. While we're with you, Emily, we've got a few people asking for kind of your advice on the Northwest Deanery interviews. Do you have any kind of specific advice based on your experience for people applying there this year?
I would say that in terms of the guidance that was given by Northwest, it wasn't as kind of prescriptive as the London interview was, but I overall found it to be a very friendly interview. I'd prepared for London first, so I felt kind of more prepared coming into my Northwest one. But in terms of the information they gave, it was very similar to what the interview was actually like. It was a very friendly experience. Just basically had the opportunity to talk and sell myself. And in terms of the clinical scenario, again, it just working through an A to E, just as you've kind of been practicing. And I was surprised that I had the time to talk and to kind of explain things. And in terms of the kind of personal motivation questions, again, it was all just kind of stuff that I practiced, and I'd actually finished my interview early, so I had kind of 3 or 4 minutes at the end, and they said, well, this is your time, you talk to us about whatever you want to talk to us about. So I would say use the time that you've got available, but if there's any kind of extra time and you've finished answering their questions, it's well worth going back to your answers and saying, oh, I've just thought of this, can I talk to you about this, or can I add to my answer? So I think just use the time you've got available because it's your time to say yourself and to get that job.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully that helps everyone that's looking to apply to the Northwest this year. I saw quite an interesting question as well that was answered earlier in the chat. I think Rich, you'd answered this in the chat for me, but I just wanted to bring it up for everyone to hear the answer. So somebody asked, what are buzzwords you would recommend we drop in our interview? What would your kind of advice be in response to that?
So I mean, here I wrote, rather than buzzwords, ensure you exude passion and motivation. Which, I mean, you know, yes, there are some key research words that would be great to, you know, pepper in when you're discussing a critical appraisal, but it needs to be context specific. So there's no, you know, point in just having some phrases that you're going to shove in regardless. But the key really is to just show that you're enjoying what you're talking about. So, you know, if you are asked to discuss a research project you're part of, say why it was great, say why this has made you apply for an SFP and why this makes you want to be an academic clinician in the first place. I mean, quite frankly, being an academic clinician, you're taking on double the workload. You know, obviously you do get a portion of time put aside to be an academic, but there's no way that the amount of time that you're given equates to the amount of work you'll end up doing. So you are essentially making your life more difficult. So you've got to point out why that is worthwhile. So being able to discuss why, you know, how you're going to balance that, but also why it is that you want to seek out, you know, that workload. So yeah, it's all about passion, I would say. I think just to add to that, someone asked earlier on quite a post-pandemic specific question about, do you look at your camera or do you look at the computer screen? And I think, you know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think, but my advice to this was look at the computer screen because you'll be looking at your interviewers, which will probably make you, you know, interact with them and kind of speak in a more natural tone than if you're just staring at a you know, camera. So I think they understand the kind of limitations of this tech world we now live in.
Yeah, I definitely want to kind of agree with what Rich said, first of all, about the kind of buzzwords, because ultimately buzzwords are kind of something that everybody uses. They're not unique to you. What's unique to you is the experience and skills you bring and your passion. So rather than kind of focusing on using buzzwords, focus on selling your experience and what you as a unique individual can bring to their program. And personally, I found that they were far more interested in hearing that. In terms of kind of the issue of kind of doing interviews online, often they'll kind of present material on the screen as well. So I think they'll understand that your eye line will kind of be flitting between looking at the material they've got displayed on the screen and also looking at them. But as long as you're kind of maintaining some form of eye contact by looking at their image at some point, I think that's kind of the key there. I had a question as well that I'd like to answer as well. It's about the West Midlands interview for those of you going for that. So unfortunately for the West Midlands, they don't give out that much information in advance, and I'm quite capped in what I can and can't say about the interview. Essentially, what I would say first of all is don't be afraid of the interview. I don't know if Rich, you would agree from your experience, but in my experience, they were very friendly. They were very interested in hearing what I could offer them and kind of what I could bring to the training program as well. And in terms of kind of what to prepare, because they give so little information and because it may well have changed since I kind of interviewed, what I would advise is kind of be prepared to answer questions on any of the things that we talked about. So they will, as per most standard interviews, ask you about kind of clinical and academic things, because obviously you're going for an SFP post. So just be prepared for kind of a mixture of things like preparing all your emergencies and the kind of common clinical and academic situations you might be in kind of experiencing, and kind of have a paper up your sleeve, as we talked about. That means that whatever they throw at you this year, you know, you've got the answer there and ready. Rich, I don't know if you would agree or have any additional advice there.
Yeah, exactly that. The only additional thing I would say is being able to talk about why it is you want the SFP, why you're good enough, and why they should pick you, I guess. And I suppose an awareness of what the foundation program actually looks like. And I think that's so difficult, because even as medical students, you know, you shadow doctors, but, you know, you don't really spend your time talking about the nitty gritty of, you know, rotas and portfolio and all that sort of thing often. But having a basic awareness of what your training is going to look like for the next 2 years will, you know, is an important thing. You know, I've just come out the other side of F2, and my F2 arguably was quite difficult in that I had one hospital rotation. I then went and did my academic block, and then I went off to GP. Now, looking back on that, I can say that was difficult because I had just 4 months to get lots of hospital-based sign-offs for my, you know, portfolio to pass the year. So that wasn't even something I was aware was a concept when I was applying for SFP. So actually, if you've got time before your interview, next time you're on placement, go and speak to an F1 or an F2 and just say, can you just sit me down and tell me what is the overall structure of how do I pass F1 and F2? What are the responsibilities on top of managing patients that you are expected to do, just so that you've got basic understanding of the structure of the foundation program.
Definitely, I would definitely agree with that. And I think all of us can agree that, you know, having spoken to people in advance that were in our deanery was something that was invaluable. We've got a few questions about the London interview. The first one is kind of about the nature of the academic part of that station. So again, I think, as we mentioned, London are very helpful and they give you lots of guidance in advance. So go and read what they've put in their handbook, because they pretty much state what's going to be in the interview and the type of interview questions there. In terms of kind of talking through your A to E in that sort of station, Emily, I'll throw this question out to you. When would you kind of advise mentioning for help and things when you're talking through your A to E?
So I think it very much depends on the station. I think as a general rule, it's probably safer to ask for help early than leave it to the end of your A to E and either get cut off or forget to mention it. or, you know, whatever else. I mean, it shows that you're kind of working within your kind of competency. I mean, if it's a scenario that you feel comfortable managing up until some point, then call for help at that point. For example, if you're not worried until you see their blood pressure and their heart rate and you think, oh, that's the right time to call for help, then that would be appropriate. Whereas if there's a blaringly obvious airway problem, then I would be calling for help very early. I think if you're not sure, it's always better to call early, but just make sure that you're making reference to the fact that you're working within your kind of competency as an F1. So again, situation dependent, but if in doubt, call early.
Yeah, definitely. And I think certainly in clinical practice, nobody's going to criticize you for calling for help if you feel out of depth. So if you feel like you've reached a point where you're stuck and you need more help, it's better to state that you would ask for help at that point, because that's what you would realistically do in that scenario as well. So I'm conscious that we're kind of coming up towards time. So I just kind of wanted to round off with a few kind of questions from the pre-submission as well. So some kinds of things that people have asked are, first of all, do you think applying for the SFP has been worth it so far? I think that's quite an interesting question. I don't know if we want to start with you, Camille, and then we can go through.
Right. So yeah, this is a difficult question because I've not done my actual research block yet. But I must admit, so far it's been a pretty good experience. You know, even if you're not doing your rotation, you're still in touch with whatever organizational bodies looking after your particular program. For example, for us, we've already been in touch with the University of Nottingham. They've been hosting meetings for us, and they've been providing us with resources and a lot of support. So I must admit, just the whole community of SFP doctors where you will be is going to be a great source of both support and you know, just friendships and everything else coming with it. So I personally am quite happy I've applied for SFP, as well as the fact that you get to know what your rotation is before everyone else is another perk of SFP program. I would say that I don't hear people talk about much, but yeah.
And I definitely agree with that. Even though I've not done my academic block yet, I've found that just by being an SFP trainee, it opens so many doors for research and opportunities within your trust. So I've already had people kind of hear about my work and be interested in involving me things just because I've got that tagline of being an academic trainee. So it really does open doors if you're interested in that. Rich, I'd be interested to hear what you think as well as someone that's obviously post SFP now. Do you think it was worth the time?
Yes, I do. If you can get the opportunity to get some formal output from your SFP, that is ideal. So what I mean by that is that's not to say publish, but if you can come out the other side and go, oh, because I did the SFP, I now have a qualification, maybe some postgraduate certificate, I have a poster or an oral presentation, or I have formed links with other academics and have gone on to, you know, be involved in projects. I think what you don't want is to kind of do the SFP, come out the other side and think that was, you know, other than my 4 months spent, you know, playing with cells in a lab, let's say, I didn't get anything from it. So given that it's only 4 months that you're actually doing the academic, I would probably advocate to be quite output focused about it. I think it is nice to have to know that that break is coming from clinical life. You know, I was an F1 during COVID. You know, it started when I was a medical student, so my F1 was pretty grimy, but I always knew that my second rotation of F2 was going to be this wonderful 4 months away from clinical. And I think being able to hang on to that was really, really nice. So yeah, I think ultimately my answer is yes.
Awesome, that's really great to hear. And last question for everybody. I'm going to ask each of you this, starting with Emily. What's one thing that you wish you'd known before you did your SFP interviews?
Oh, I think this has already been mentioned, but check your Wi-Fi and your technology. I had kind of briefly done this, but actually in the start of my Northwest interview, I'd been speaking for about 3 minutes, A to E. I couldn't see the panelists. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I thought, oh, maybe they can hear me, I'm just going to keep going. Turns out they couldn't, and I'd lost 3 minutes of my interview, so I had to move into the kitchen, which had a cardboard cutout of Ainsley Harriott in the background, which I didn't realise until the very end of my interview. And I was really flustered, and it turns out they were all really friendly, and actually it didn't matter. So if things go wrong in your interview, stay calm, because they're probably not going as wrong as you think they are. Make sure you're kind of prepared and you've got a kind of good setup, but just be aware that things can happen, especially if your interviews are online. So just stay calm, and just remember, like, the work you've done to get here, and that this is your time to say yourself. So put any kind of anxieties to the back of your head if you're able to, and just keep going if something happens.
Lovely, thank you. Camille, how about you? What's one thing you wish you'd known before your interview?
So for me, it's kind of similar to Emily's as well. You know, you're in this interview, you're very scared, you're very stressed about everything, and you've got a panel in front of you. Some of them might be happy, some of them might not be. Don't let any of that throw you. You're there for yourself ultimately, and you're there to sell yourself and not please anyone else. So don't let, you know, quick fire questions throw you. If someone comes across as moody, it might just be a way to test you in a way. So don't let that affect your answers and then the way you feel about yourself afterwards as well. One more thing, if I could add, is after the interview, just completely relax for a bit. It's done. Don't do any more research. Don't double check your answers. Just take a moment and just be yourself.
Thank you. Rich, how about you? What's one thing you'd wish you'd known?
So possibly controversial, but I think we put so much pressure on ourselves with the SFP. You know, I think everybody in this chat, everyone who's going for this, wants it because, you know, they are interested in academics. They, you know, probably doing very well at medical school, and it becomes this thing where it's like, well, if I don't get that, I'm rubbish. And actually, I think, you know, it is only 4 months ultimately. You can still be an academic and a researcher despite having this title. Once you get to foundation program, no one really cares. And I think that was a big thing for me. I was like, oh, it's the be all and end all. And within a month of being, you know, just a clinical doctorate on a ward, I think I'd completely forgotten about that identity of, oh, I'm also an SFP doctor. And I think that's quite a humbling experience, actually, to kind of just be thrown into the rest of your cohort. And so I think, yeah, my advice is, if someone had said to me beforehand, like, yes, I know you want this, but also if you don't get it, it really isn't the end of the world. You can still do and be everything you want to. That would have been nice to have heard. So hopefully. Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks so much. And I think just to close on, my one thing that I wish I'd known is kind of sort of a tangent off of that, but it's not, it's basically, don't undervalue the power of rest in this sort of process, because 5th year is definitely a marathon, particularly at Birmingham. I'm sure Emily and Camille will agree that 5th year was definitely a marathon, and you've got so many things to be doing. So make sure that, as I've kind of tried to emphasize through the series, do take that rest time, do be kind of pragmatic with the amount of preparation that you do. Don't overwork yourself in the process of preparing, because as Rich says, it's not the be all and end all. It's just one way of getting into academia, but it's by no means the only way. So make sure you're looking after yourselves as well. And on that note, I think that's quite a nice note to end today's session. So thank you so much, both to our panelists and to everyone that's come tonight. I've got everyone's details. Everyone has very kindly offered them up. So if you do have any questions that weren't answered today, do feel free to email one of us or all of us, and we'll try and get back to you as soon as we can. If you have any feedback from this session or from any of the sessions previously, we'd very much appreciate it. And I genuinely do read all of your responses. So it's great to hear your feedback. It helps us improve our teaching. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining me, not only for this session, but also for the whole series. It's been a real pleasure, and I really hope that your interviews go well. Remember, we're all here to support you. We're all kind of rooting for you. So best of luck, and hopefully I'll see you around soon. Take care, everyone.